Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this lecture titled, as you can see, let me put it in presentation form, titled Great Readers of the Bible Are Great Readers of Poetry. This is a lecture in various forms that I've given over the years because I end up teaching a lot of poetic texts, mostly, in the prophets and things like that. And so I've kind of refined it over the years, and I don't know, this is probably like version 10.0 or something, I'm not quite sure. But it's a new version of the lecture, so if you've taken classes from me in the past, especially I'm thinking of Jeremiah, which I've taught I think 6 times or so, then you've heard some variation of this, but do make sure still to watch it because it has changed a little bit, and we will do at the end a kind of walkthrough of a specific text that I haven't ever taught in this lecture before. So anyways, as the title says, great readers of the Bible are great readers of poetry, or another way you could put it, in order to be a great reader of the Bible, one must be a great reader of poetry, and that's in fact sort of the thesis of this little lecture. So about 1/3 of the OT is poetry. Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. That number does not hold true if you shift over to the New Testament. The New Testament, I've never sat down and counted all of them, but I'm pretty certain that it's quite a bit lower, and that's in large part because, of course, the gospel is largely narratival material. Of course, there are poems and poetic material kind of interlaced throughout all of it, but the driving force of the Gospels is narrative. And then when you move into the epistles, you're working, of course, with epistolary language or epistolary literature, and so it's done in the form of an oral letter. It's often explanatory and pedagogical, just quite different than the OT. The place where, and again, I've never sat down to count this, but I'd have to imagine that when you look at the NT, if you wanted to find the most poetry-rich books, I'm anticipating you'd look at Hebrews and Revelation, in part because they're drawing so heavily from the OT and often quoting directly. In fact, the longest quotation of an Old Testament book within the New Testament is in the book of Hebrews, and we'd have to confirm this with Dr. Kester, but I think it's in the 8th chapter where the book of Hebrews quotes a long segment from the book of comfort in the book of Jeremiah. And so in any case, I'd have to say that if you shift over to the NT side, these numbers change a little bit. With that said, I would still argue that you cannot read the Bible well if you cannot read poetry well. And so that's really the big question of today's lecture is, how do we read biblical poetry well? Now, over these first couple weeks, you're going to read a couple of somewhat technical, I don't know if that's really the right word, they're really introductions to the kind of the scholarly study of Hebrew poetry. And you'll be reading in particular pieces from Chip Dobbs also, and then Adele Berlin, both of whom are massive voices within the world of Hebrew Bible scholarship. And largely the question that they're trying to answer is, what is Hebrew poetry? And in many ways, this has been kind of the driving question for those who are interested in scholars who are interested in the poetry of the Hebrew Bible is, well, what is it and how do you recognize it? It's kind of like, that's really the level of the question that these articles are functioning on. And so how do you know if you're this is simplifying it a bit, how do you know if the animal that you're looking at is a duck or an eagle? and so they're in some ways answering questions like, well, how do you know if the text you're looking at is poetry or prose? In many ways, those are the kind of larger theoretical questions. I'm not as interested in this lecture is not focused so much on identifying Hebrew poetry. I, of course, assume it's there. I'm not, frankly, that interested in getting into minute arguments about whether one text is poetry and another is not. Those conversations have their place. I think when it comes to a class like ours, where it's about where we're primarily concerned with reading the Bible in the context of ministry, I think different questions become much more interesting. And consider this, like, Consider the liturgy. I just did a funeral yesterday, a memorial service yesterday, and I was kind of struck by the amount of poetry that our liturgy contains. And so next time you're in a church service, I'm actually recording this on Sunday morning just before church service, so I'll do this too. Next time you're in a church service, just pause and say, how much of this is poetic? And you don't have to, again, you don't have to get too technical and say, well, does it have parallelism, or does it have, all that stuff? Does it have density of imagery? Does it have terseness of, does it use language, the English language, tersely? You'll be able to generally recognize what's poetry and what's not. Don't worry too much about that. But when you're in that liturgy, just ask how much of this leans in the direction of poetry. And of course, I've never counted it before, but it's a lot of it, right? Every hymn you sing will be poetic and will be in verse. Much of the liturgy, all of the Psalms, of course, and many of the readings. If you have readings from the prophets, or if during Advent, you're going to have all these readings from Isaiah, all poetry. During the hymns and special music and whatnot, it's all poetry. And so your services the services that you are attending, if you're in a kind of traditional sort of mainline church setting, and even if you're not, it's still going to be filled with poetry. Even you go to an evangelical church, right? And maybe it's or a Pentecostal or whatever, non-denominational. They may be less heavy on kind of call response liturgical structures, but they will probably be heavier on the singing, right? So even there, you're going to find poetry prevails. And so from my perspective, learning how to read poetry well is an important ministry skill, because you are going to be doing it just about every single week, either as a participant in a worship service or as the leader. So it's really important, not just for reading the Bible, but also for really church life in general, that we know how to read poetry well and effectively. And it's in a way that's impactful, and also help others to be able to do so and to appreciate it as such, right? Because if they're taking in all this poetry, it's useful if they know or have some helpful ways of engaging in that poetry. So that's the thesis for the day. So let's ask the question, how does one read biblical poetry well? You actually have a nice example of this in the Dobbs Alsop article. He goes through and does a kind of reading of a text based on some of the theoretical or some of the kind of key identifiers that he finds earlier. We'll do something similar, but you'll find, I think this is a little bit different even than what Dobbs Alsop is doing. Okay, I have 6 points that I want to make here, and I'll just kind of walk through them one at a time, and just sort of give illustrations and examples throughout. But I think the idea here would be, if you were to sit down, if you needed, these are, maybe I should have retitled this slide differently to say something like habits of a good poetry reader or something like that, because this really what this is about, is developing poetic habits or habits of reading poetry. And so that when you sit down to read, when you sit down to read your Hebrew Bible, we're going to read in just a little bit from Bereshit, the second chapter, is from Genesis, the second chapter, and we're going to read through a poem. So, when you sit down, you'll kind of have ingrained in your mind that, okay, I'm encountering a poem. How should I go about doing that? And these are 6 ideas that I have. First of all, I think you should read the poem out loud and in Hebrew. Or, if you're reading it in the New Testament, of course, in Greek, you're reading it in the original language. Because one of the things we know from Dobbs Alsop and from Berlin is that the poets, of course, the Hebrew poets didn't write with English in view, right? Or Norwegian or German or whatever else, the language it is in which you encounter these things. They wrote it in Hebrew and for Hebrew. And so all of the imaginative use of language is going to be grounded within that linguistic system. And so you are missing something if you are reading your Hebrew poems in English. There's no way around it. You are missing stuff. And you will not be able, in my view, to appreciate as deeply these texts if you are reading them in English as opposed to reading them, or maybe just put it, if you're reading them in translation, as opposed to reading them in Hebrew. Of course, there are going to be things that there are going to be new insights that emerge from translating into English, and that's fine. I'm just saying that we're talking about appreciating Hebrew poetry. If you want to appreciate it to the greatest possible extent, you need to read it, I would say, out loud, and also in Hebrew. And the reason I say out loud is because when you read it out loud, you can more easily pick up on sound rhymes and also vocal patterns. I'm sure you, we'll get to that in just a second, but it matters how it sounds. Many of these poems, I believe, especially like the Psalms, were meant to be read out loud, or sometimes congregationally, right? Like maybe in a responsive kind of way. And so I think a lot of the poems assume a level of orality, and so I think we more properly appreciate what they were intended to do if we read them out loud. So, and especially also in Hebrew, right? It's not just, it drives me crazy, to see ministers who sort of would flaunt their knowledge of original languages over their congregations. That's not the point. The point is you've been sent off, or you're here online or whatever, to do an education so that you can come into encounter with the gifts that are here in the text and then share them, not to hold it over people, as if you know more than them, but to bring forth the gifts from these texts. And I think we can only really do that if we're reading them in their original languages. So that's the first point, is that insofar as you are able, engage these texts in Hebrew and read them out loud. Or in the case of Daniel, right, or some Ezra and Nehemiah, a couple of in Jeremiah, you even get to read them in Aramaic, because the Hebrew Bible has a lot of Aramaic in it too. Okay, so that's the first point, out loud and in Hebrew. Secondly, read slowly, deliberately, and attentively, paying careful attention to the features lifted up by Berlin and Dobbs Alsop. So Dobbs Alsop talks a lot about lineation, right? The demarcation of poetic lines, and I think he's right that this is primarily done through parallelism, right? So if you kind of put two lines alongside one another, what demarcates the line is the beginning and the ending of the parallel, and of the parallel line. And so actually, let's just look at an example of that. Let me close this out. Let's just go to Psalm 18 really quickly. Okay, let's just look here at the first line. Let me enlarge it a little bit. Okay, whoops, sorry about that. We'll start at verse 2. Okay, so the Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. My God is my rock in whom I take refuge. So you can see the parallelism really, really strong there. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, my deliverer. My God is my rock in whom I take refuge. And so the line actually begins with this list of three objects to which God is delivered, to which God is compared. Yahweh is compared. And then the second parallel line begins with the same a comparison with God as rock, but then also names the way in which the poet is going to engage, and what that actually means. Because God is a rock and a fortress and deliverer, I can take refuge in God. But you can see here the way that these parallel lines kind of work to demarcate the ending of lines. And so the translators have also helped you with this. If you were to turn, to like and look at like the manuscripts of these psalm texts, they wouldn't be broken up in lines this way. You see all this white space. So just as an example, let me pull up another text. We'll just say 1 Kings 2. Okay, so you notice the difference here. No significance in 1 Kings 2. I just know it's all narrative. Notice the difference between the spacing, right? Here you have all this white space, right, on the edges, indicating the ending of lines. That's why there's white spaces, because the translators are helping you recognize it as poetry. Whereas narrative here, it's sort of margin to margin. So that's what that's what the white space is for, is to help you recognize lineation, to help you recognize that you're looking at poetry, and that part of the significance of poetry is where the lines begin and end. So let's look at verse 6. That's another great example. In my distress, I called to the Lord. I cried to my God for help. So the two parallel lines are, I called to the Lord, I cried to my God for help. They're repeating, they're echoes of one another. I called to the Lord, I cried to the God for help, but they're not identical. It's not like it's completely, it's not the complete repetition of one line over the other. It is repetitive, but it's using different language, different verbs, even different names for God, right? And so that's the first kind of thing you need to, let me go back to my notes here. So that's the first thing. You need to pay careful attention to these different features. So lineation is important. Where do the lines begin and the end? Parallelism is really important. And when it comes to parallelism, it's important to, oh, sorry, whoops, wrong page. This is business stuff. I manage the social media for this guy. Let's see. So we go back to, okay, so I kind of lost my place here. Okay, so the lines are marked here, like I said, through the spacing, and it's important to ask the question. This is what I wanted to say. So we notice the parallelism, right? I called to the Lord, I cried to my God for help, and it's an important question. You say, okay, I noticed this parallelism here or here. From his temple, he heard my voice. My cry came before him into his ears. Clearly examples, great examples actually, of parallelism. But it's not just enough to say, oh, that's a nice bit of parallelism, right? That's what Dobbs Alsop in Berlin told me to look for. Ask the question, what is the relationship between the two lines? Are the two lines simply echoing one another? Does the second line add more specificity? What kind of imagery is used in one line over the other? So just as an example, in this first parallel line, from his temple he heard my voice. Okay, so we have this image of the temple. That's powerful. We have this image of the voice of the worshiper, or the supplicant, the person who's crying out to God. And then the second language, though, is more corporeal. It kind of emphasizes the body of God in some different ways. For example, my cry came before him, into his presence, into his ears. And so now we're into like this imagery of the body of God, the presence of God. That's so interesting, right? And so then to ask the question, like, why that shift? What benefit could it be for the poet to poetically, to render poetically the body of God? What is that? Why does that matter? To think about God embodied in that way, and embodied in that way, but and then also present in the temple, right? And so those are the kinds of attentive questions that we need to ask ourselves when we're reading slowly and deliberately and attentively, paying special attention to these poetic features. Because these poetic features like parallelism and lineation, the imaginative use of language, often in poetry, as Dobbs Alsop, I think, and both of them actually, Berlin and Dobbs Alsop lived off, is that the language often is pushed to its extremes in poetry, and that's purposeful. Poetry is sort of a linguistic playground in many ways, where words can be stretched beyond maybe their original meaning, or maybe the best way of putting it, not original meaning, but their common use. They can be pushed beyond their common use for the sake of what's happening there in the poem, for the sake of the kind of imaginary world that the poet's creating. And so pay attention to those features, not just so you can say that's a poem and that's prose, but so you can ask the question, what is this poem using these things for? What benefit is there in the parallelism? What does it mean? And we'll see this a little bit later. What does it mean that one word is rhyming with another? Why is that important? All of those things, if you just sort of breeze through or read quickly through a poem just so you can get through with it, you're going to miss most of that stuff. One of the analogies I like to use, I'm just checking my recording time, okay? One of the analogies that I like to use is, think about it this way. When you're reading poetry, it's like you don't want to eat it like you're going to McDonald's, right? It's sit down, not fast food. So what's the difference? And I'm using some English idioms there. So for those of you who for whom English is not your first language, what I mean is that in English, when we talk about fast food, we're talking about a place where you like go through a drive-through, you get your food, and you often do it because you don't have time, to go home and make lunch, or maybe you forgot your lunch, and so you just think, I just need to do something really fast. I'm going to stop at Subway, get it, and the whole encounter will be under 5 minutes, and that's exactly what you want, right? Whereas a sit-down restaurant, that would be a place like maybe a nice restaurant that you would go to celebrate something like your graduation or your anniversary, or think about some of the important like a wedding feast or a wedding celebration. Often there's food there, and it would be strange. I think it would be strange, and I photograph weddings too. That's part of my photography and marketing businesses, that we do a lot of wedding photographs. It would be strange for me if somebody were to come in with like one of those to-go boxes and like go in and put the wedding cake and the food in a to-go box and then leave. It would be out of place. At least in America, maybe it happens. If that were going to happen anywhere, it would happen in America, but I don't think that it does, and so probably doesn't happen anywhere elsewhere where you bring in your fast food to-go box and then leave, at a wedding festival or some kind of major birthday celebration or something, right? The point is the experience, not just to get your food in and out. That's the issue, is that there's a disjunction between, how the food is used in a particular context. So, end of parable, back to poetry. Poetry similarly is not takeout. Right? If you are going to appreciate properly a poem, you need to think about it as sit down, or as it's about the experience, and the experience takes time to appreciate. And so I want you to remember that as you're reading these poems. Especially consider, we're reading a lot of poetry, especially as we move toward the end of the semester, when we're reading large chunks of Isaiah in our last 3 weeks together. I want you to give yourself time to process that material. To be perfectly honest, I think you should start reading Isaiah now, or maybe at the middle of the semester. Start reading through it so you can actually have time to appreciate the poems for what they are, and so you can sort of pay attention to these features. Another analogy I like to use is that poems, you don't generally read poems in the same way that you'd read, hold on, let me look for something here, on my desk. I was looking for some kind of instruction manual. So, okay, just as an example, let's just say I got, let's just say I got my new iPad. It's not new, but let's just say I just got my new iPad. Okay, so I open it up, and I don't know how to do anything on it. Let's just pretend that that's true. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the instruction manual, or now we have quick startup guides or whatever, basically what's the fastest possible way that I can start using this device. We go to that for convenience, right? Because we want to quickly be able to know, how do I use this device? That is not how you read a poem. Poems are much more like people than they are like these, like instruction manuals. And what I mean by that is, in order to get to know a person really well, it's pretty hard to do in a short period of time. And there's no sort of predetermined script or instruction manual. People don't come with instruction manuals. And so you really it takes time and effort and curiosity in order to appreciate properly a human being. Similarly with poems, if you want to appreciate them more fully, I think you need to treat them not as it's not an information exchange. You're trying to download information or just get info as quickly as possible from a poem. It's going to be a patient process. It's probably something that you're going to have to revisit multiple times. And you're going to need to be very attentive to the smallest of things, because poets are often very attentive to the smallest of things, and you need to meet them there, right? For those of you that write poems, I'll be really interested to hear kind of your responses this week in the forums, especially from those of you who either write poetry or maybe read it frequently, how some of these these 6 habits might be true or not true for your experience. So let's move on. 2 is maybe one of the most important points. That's why I spent a lot of time there. But just read them slowly, deliberately, attentively. Treat the poems like people and not like they're instruction manuals or science books or something like that. So, and 3 is kind of related. Read for the encounter and not just for information, right? These are not instruction manuals. This is not like your high school textbook or something like that, social studies textbook, where you're just trying to get enough information so you can pass the test or something like that. You read for the encounter with the poem itself, and reading it out loud will help with that, but that's not the whole game, right? Just read these texts with the mindset of, I want to experience this poem. I'm not just here to get data or to get information. So fourthly, read the poem visually. Now earlier, let's see, let's go back to Psalm 18. Okay, actually, before I go to Psalm 18, let me say one other thing. Bill Brown is a friend of mine, William Brown. He wrote a book called Seeing the Psalms, and I think it's a lovely book. And Bill is just a tremendous and gracious person. He teaches at Columbia Theological Seminary I think he still teaches there, in Georgia, in Atlanta, Decatur, Georgia. He wrote this great book called Seeing the Psalms. I really encourage you to read it. It's written at a level where you could use it for a congregational study too, no doubt. But Bill's really behind this fourth point. Read the Psalms visually. Put in a different way, what do the psalmists want you to see? What kind of image are they trying to create in your minds? So let's look at verse 7. This is Psalm 18 again. Psalm 18 is just such a great example for these kinds of illustrating biblical poetry. Let's look at verse 7, and then I like verse 15 too. Verse 7, the earth trembled and quaked. So that's not just seeing, that's hearing too, right? It's activating all these senses. The foundations of the mountain, they shook. They trembled because he was angry. God was angry. And so amazing stuff going on here, that the psalmist wants you to hear something, the quaking in the earth, to see something, the earth trembling. If any of you have ever been in an earthquake before, it's kind of terrifying, right? But that's what it makes me think about it. My freshman year at Pacific Lutheran University, there was a big, I think it was a 6.5 earthquake near Tacoma, Washington, where I was, and I was in the dining room, and suddenly, like, all the it's sort of like in the movies, right? All the hanging plants started to like move back and forth, and there was like this deep sort of resounding rumbling, and then you could sort of see things shaking around. It was crazy, but it was just like this in verse 7, so we all got under the table until it's done, and blah, blah, blah. I don't think anybody was actually hurt on our campus. Thank the Lord. But in any case, if you've had those experiences, this will kind of trigger those in you, and you'll think, wow, it is really true. Like, this is what it feels like. It trembles, it quakes, there's sound, there's visuals. It feels like the foundations of the mountains, if that were, geologically true, like they actually shook. And so what the psalmist does is interprets this theologically, right? This is the anger of God, or this is what the anger of God feels like. It's terrifying. It's feels like your life is under threat. All of these different things. And so try to see the Psalms, and not just see the Psalms, but hear the Psalms and smell them. And so you could imagine like how interesting it would be liturgically to have a service that paid attention to the visuals of the Psalm, that paid attention to what the psalmist wanted you to see. Let's look at another example. At 15, the valleys of the sea were exposed, and the foundations of the earth laid bare. At your rebuke, O Lord, at the blast of breath from your nostrils. Ooh, that's such interesting language, right? In Hebrew, linguistically, of course, the words for anger and for nostrils are linguistically related to one another. And so you get this image of a blast of breath from God's face. And so we have the corporeal part of corporeal part of the poem where God's body is imagined. And it's tied in again to God's anger and God's wrath, and also to creation, right? The creation is responding or also manifesting in part God's anger. So the valleys are exposed, the foundations are laid bare. Creation's foundations are laid bare because of God's anger. This is what God's anger is like. It's like all of creation is falling apart. Right? That's what it's like to experience God's anger, is that creation seems to be unraveling. And so that's nice. But again, back to the main point though, see the Psalms, or maybe hear and feel and smell the Psalms. What is that visual that the Psalms are trying to create? And I think, again, if you read slowly and deliberately, you will encounter and experience these Psalms in really different ways. Okay, verse 5. I hit this a little bit already, so I won't make too big a point of it. Read across the lines, meaning across parallel lines, pondering how parallel lines are related to one another, what kind of repetition is happening. So is the line saying, line A or line B is basically repeating parallel line A, or is line B advancing something, or maybe providing something more specific? So the way it's talked about in scholarship, A, what's more B? So line A, what's more B? So in some ways B kind of specifies or brings the imagery to a different kind of level. It's not simply synonym, it's also advancing line A in some way. Or it can be oppositional as well. A, but B. Right? And so A may be true, but then there's this oppositional line as well. We'll see some of this more as we get into wisdom literature, is the sort of A but B kind of thing, where B is sort of in opposition to A. But in short, you are asking the question, okay, you identified parallelism. What kind of parallelism, and how are the lines interacting with one another? Are there points of tension? Are they kind of basically in accordance with one another and just repeating one another? Is somehow the imagery being advanced to a different level? Like earlier in Psalm 18 we saw let's see, what were we looking at? Where was that? Oh yeah, it was verse 2, right? Let's see, no, it wasn't verse 2. Oh, yeah, here's a good example. We'll just do a new one in verse 4. This is, I think, a good example of A, what's more B. So the cords of death entangled me, right? It's like he's being constricted by the cords of death. The psalmist is really having a strong encounter with death. What's more, the torrents of destruction overwhelmed me. So now it's not just cords, it's also like storms or waves. And so you have to ask the question, like, what's the relationship between these lines? And the second one seems to intensify, I would say, brings the psalmist closer to death than the psalmist already is. And so you just want to look at how those are interacting, how the lines are interacting with one another. And finally, read with an eye toward remix. I also work in real estate too, right? Slipping in here. Read with an eye toward remix and sampling. Okay, what do I mean by this? The biblical poems will often sample or remix material from elsewhere in the biblical texts. And so let's just take an example. Let's see, that's the wrong one. Let's look at Psalm 89. Okay, and then... So Psalm 89 is really one of the most dramatic psalms that you will encounter. And what it's really doing is it's a kind of exilic psalm, probably, made from during the time of the exile, when the psalmist is lamenting the fact that, maybe let me put it in stronger language. basically the psalmist is accusing God of abandoning God's promises to David. So here we have in verse 3, you said, I have made a covenant with my chosen one. I have sworn to David my servant, I will establish your line forever and make your throne throughout all generations. So the psalmist is literally sampling here, right, from an earlier biblical text or maybe another biblical text, and is later going to say, God, you are reneging on that promise. You did not keep that promise. And the psalmist is going, and the psalmist interprets the experience of exile and the fact that the Davidic king is no longer on the throne, right? I mean, this is historically true. There is no one on David's throne because David's throne doesn't exist. The Babylonians sort of wipe it out. And so what the psalmist will do, though, is here in verse 38, you have rejected, you have spurned, you have been very angry with your anointed one, you have renounced the covenant with your servant, you have defiled his crown in the dust. And so the psalmist accuses God of actually breaking that covenant, and then will ask questions like, how long will you hide yourself? How long will your wrath burn like fire? And so the psalmist sees God's hiddenness in the end of the Davidic line, and so it's a really interesting psalm, but it's one where you really see more sampling, right? Sampling is if you're not familiar with that language, this is used in kind of contemporary music to talk about how maybe one artist will take lines or rhythms or lyrics or whatever, sounds from an earlier artist's song and will rework them into their own song. And so we see this kind of remixing and sampling happen throughout the Bible. And I think if we're going to appreciate properly kind of how this stuff works, how the biblical poems work, then we need to have our eyes open and paying attention to remix and sampling. So here's what I want to do just as a conclusion. I want to read a bit through this poem. This is from Genesis 2:23. This is probably the Old Testament's first poem. Hold on, let me check my time. Okay. This is probably the OT's very first poem. It kind of depends on whether you think, Genesis 1, this, the creation story in Genesis 1:1 through 2:3. Is whether you think it's actually a poem. I think it's, there are certainly poetic elements to it. I think it's up in the air. But in any case, this is probably the very first unambiguous poem. And let's read it first out loud in Hebrew. Let's see. Okay, and then we're just going to, you'll notice here the text also breaks this into lines. So let's read that out loud slowly so you can try and follow along. And then we'll look at a translation. So Zot hapa'am. Zot hapa'am. Etzem me'atzamai. Etzem me'atzamai. Uvasar mibsari. Remember this is when you have the vav before the beit mem pe, it's u and not ve, right? I don't think we have a vav here, but like here in the beginning of verse 73, Vayomer ha'adam. Vayomer ha'adam. So you have the vav here, making the v sound. But here it's uvasar mibsari lezot yikare isha ki meish lukacha zot. Okay, so let's look at one rendition of this. This is now, and let me see if I can do this, kind of bring them both up. I'm working on getting a copy of BibleWorks right now, y'all, so normally I would show it to you on that, but for now this will have to work. Okay, it's not going to work. This is Zot hapa'am. This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman. This is a great example of how you need to be reading in Hebrew, right? For she is taken out of man. So what I said just there about she shall be called woman. Lazot yikare isha. It shall be called she shall be called woman. She shall be called woman. Ki meish, because from a man she was taken, lukacha zot. I'm sorry, lukacha zot. And so you can see here the kind of rhyming that's happening here. Isha, she shall be called Isha, a woman or wife, because meish, because she is from the ish, she is from a man. And or similarly, we have bone of my bones, right? Etzem me'atzamai, the yod here being personal pronoun. Excuse me, but bone from my bones, or here's flesh. Uvasar mibsari, and flesh from my flesh. So the mem, right, is here. We have the mem here, which is from, same as here, me. They just are vocalized differently because of the letters that follow, ayin and beit. But here we have great parallelism, right? We also have a yod, personal pronouns. So etzem me'atzamai uvasar mibsari. So you have these kind of parallel lines. So, but you're gonna, some of that you can catch in English, like bone from my bones, flesh from my flesh. Okay, that makes sense. But not this isha ki me'amish. I'm sorry, ki me'ish, because the words in English don't really work together that well. And so, again, just another reason why you should really be reading this stuff in Hebrew if you can, or at least to the best of your ability, try and engage with that poetic language. So that's one of the first things to notice. Something else to notice is that parallelism really does create nice, strong lineation. And notice also, one of the features that Berlin and adopts also lift up is the kind of terseness and density of language. Notice the difference between a sentence, like the sentences prior here. Then the Lord God made a woman from the rib he had taken, or the side he had taken out of the man, and he brought her to the man. Like, this is a really long line. Notice what happens though when the man breaks into poetry, right? Everything becomes really, really short. Zot hapa'am, etzem me'atzamai. Everything is really, really short. There aren't many verbs. In fact, let's see. I don't think there. Yeah, there's just a couple of verbs right here, right? You have the passive yikare and then lukacha. Lukacha. You have these two verbs here, but not a lot of verb action going on. Everything's compressed, and so what it does, what that compression of language, what the poem actually helps us do here, is it sets apart the man's response as something remarkable. He has seen something amazing. He's encountered something amazing, so amazing that he's going to put it into poetry, right? I mean, so appropriate in this kind of cheesy, right? But as somebody who was born in the 80s, right? Love songs are like the thing, but like so appropriate, right? That the first encounter between the man and the one who will be his wife is he breaks out into what is effectively a kind of like a song of attraction, or a song of a sort of romantic song, saying this is the one, this is the one. That's such an interesting line. The way that and this is also interesting, the way that where's my stuff. The way that zot is used. Now, let's take this apart, right? What is zot? Anybody remember? Zot is a demonstrative. So that's like in English, if I'm holding up my cup here, I say this one. This is my cup. Demonstrative points toward, the near demonstrative points toward something. And that's what zot is. But in Hebrew, we have to conjugate these, right, but from one gender to the other. So zot it ends with tav, which suggests that it's feminine, right? This is the one. Who is he talking about? He's talking about Isha. He's talking about the woman that he sees. Zot. And zot is used 3 times. Hey, where'd you go? Zot here, it's the very first word. So it's like, I think it's important that the demonstrative is the very first, it's not just the first word, it's also the last word. And then there are, between the first and the last, there is a zot in between, and there are 5 words between, 5 words preceding the zot, and then 5 words before the next one. So it's the 6th word. Zot hapa'am. Zot is the very first word that's used and the very last one. Zot hapa'am, and then lukacha zot. And I think it's important that these three zots are used because they're emphasizing how emphatic, how surprised. It's like an outcry. I can't believe it. This is the one. I mean, that's really the first line is Zot hapa'am. This is her. This is the one. And so the poetry kind of sets apart the man's response in a way that's very powerful, clearly poetic, and just really emphasizes the climactic nature of this particular moment. So, but you got to pay attention to that stuff to be able to notice it. And now let's look at one other thing before we kind of conclude this reading. And that is the phrase, let's see, Lezot yikare isha kimeish. This whole language, or kind of the whole notion of derivation, okay, that the one is derived from the other. So we see it actually here. Etzem me'atzamai. Etzem me'atzamai. Remember, this is a segolid, right? That's why I'm accenting it differently. It's like melech or eretz. Etzem, it has the two segoliths underneath. Etzem me'atzamai, bone from my bone, okay? The min here, so indicating derivation. This one comes from me, from my bones. Or here, uvasar mibsari, again, the mem here, flesh from my flesh. And then lastly, the last derivation is isha, yikare isha, ki me'ish, because she's from a man, from me. I mean, literally, right? That's from the story. God puts him under, and then takes this this selah from the man and this rib or the side of him, and then makes her from him. So the whole kind of concept of derivation, that she comes from him, has, I think, sparked a really problematic history of interpretation. A lot of times, people have assumed that because she is derived from him, because she comes from him, she is somehow secondary to him. But if you're paying careful attention to the larger narrative in which this works, you would know that derivation is not code for subordination. In fact, it's code for interdependence. Let me show you what I mean. Code is not the best language, but it's a way of signaling derivation. So let's look back at how the human man, how the guy was created. Okay, let's look at verse 7. And I don't have the Hebrew text up, but I'll just read it to you, okay? And you can open your Hebrew text, so Genesis 2, verse 7. Or if you need to look at it in English, that's fine. It's on the screen in front of you. 2, verse 7. Okay, here we go. Okay, here we go. So verse 7, it says, I'm going to read it in Hebrew, then we'll translate. Vayitzer Adonai Elohim et ha'adam afar, min, there's the min ha'adama, vayifach be'afav nishmat. Okay, so we'll just stop, we'll just stop there. And the thing I want to draw your attention to is actually this line. From the dust of the ground. Actually, it's really this whole phrase. The man is made min ha'adam, right? So actually what it says in Hebrew is, in Vayitzer, Yahweh Adonai, or the Lord God, Adonai Elohim, he formed like a potter, is how you could say. Vayitzer is the word yatzar is like the word for potter. He formed et ha'adam, he formed the man, or a man, afar min ha'adam, from the dust of the ground. And so the man, the Adam, is made min ha'adama. The man is made from the Adama. And what we learn earlier in the story is that no shrub had yet appeared on the earth, and no plant had yet sprung up, because the Lord had not, and because there was no one to work the ground. So what do we know about the relationship between Adam, Ha'adam, and Ha'adama? What we know is that the two depend on one another. right? The man depends on the ground for the food, for his food and also for his work, but the ground also depends on the man. So there is this kind of symbiotic, intimate relationship between Ha'adam and Ha'adamah. And the way that that symbiotic, intimate, interdependent relationship is signaled is through derivation. The Ha'adam is formed min Ha'adamah. And so this notion of derivation is communicated through the rhyme, right? Adam and Adamah, and also from the use of this preposition min, that he comes from it. Now, what does that mean for our poem here? That when we read about the fact that the Isha comes Me'ish comes from the man, that doesn't mean that because she's derived from him, that somehow she's subordinate to him. I think in the larger kind of universe of the story, what it means is that just as the man, the Ha'adam, is dependent on Ha'adamah for his food, and the ground in turn is dependent upon Ha'adam in order for it to kind of come into its own, fully come into its own, so the man and the woman here, the Isha and the Ish, are also mutually dependent on one another. There is a kind of, so derivation signals their mutual dependence upon one another, that they need one another. And the man recognizes this, the Ha'adam, recognizes this in his poem Zot ha'pa'am etzem me'atzamai uvasar mibsari lezot yikare isha ki me'ish lukacha zot. He explodes into this demonstrative poem which says, this is the one, she is from me, I see her in me, she sees me in her, that kind of thing. We are derived, she is derived from me, and we are therefore dependent deeply upon one another. And so that's just a bit of a reading that I wanted to do, kind of using these principles. And we didn't even go into all this, right? Like we didn't think about the visuals of this or the corporeality of it. In this case, there's not a ton of use of metaphor here, but there is a lot of use of imagery, right? Like with the bones and the flesh and all of that stuff. It's kind of, like I said, it's very corporeal. You know, what you're seeing there is kind of a bloody affair. But I think, I hope that you can see the benefit of reading poems in this deliberate kind of way that pays close attention to the original language, that reads it slowly and deliberately, that reads for the encounter and not just for information, that seeks to try and see the psalm or see the poem and not just kind of, you know, pump it for info, and that kind of reads across these parallel lines. How do they play with one another? So, all right, friends, that's the lecture for the day. That's our lecture on how do we read biblical poems well, and I hope you'll take that into the week and into the semester and begin to read poems with these particular habits in mind. All right, everyone, have a great day, okay?